going from this place of being like, there's no space for queerness in my faith, and I must resist this and suppress this, to like, oh, I'm not just something that should be embraced. I actually am something that needs to be shared. Like, and people like me actually have something really beautiful to reveal about unique characters of God, and people might actually know our God better by knowing me.
This is Down to Earth Conversations, where we hear from ordinary people who are helping to bring a bit of heaven down to earth. Kia ora, welcome to another episode of Down to Earth Conversations with me, your host, Angie Dixon. As I release this, we've just reached the end of Transgender Awareness Week, and today, the day of release of this episode, is International Transgender Day of Remembrance, where those who have been murdered because of transphobia are remembered. It's abhorrent to me that anyone dies or is even the victim of violence because of hate and prejudice, and these people deserve to be remembered. Growing up in the church, the culture that I was in taught me to fear and shun transgender people, and to be honest, we didn't even have language for it. But we were trained to see them as other and somehow abhorrent. And there was no question at all that trans people couldn't be Christian. It was very much a case of us and them. Today it's my privilege to host Steff Fenton, who gets in the way of all of that prejudice that I was taught. Steff, who uses the pronouns they, them, is transgender and is not only Christian, but has co-founded and co-pastored a church, has a Masters of Divinity, and lets their faith shape their way of being in the world. Steff is an amazingly loving human being who longs to see everyone embraced for who they are. Now, I imagine that for many of you, this may be the first time hearing from a transgender person, and it may bring a range of emotions or reactions out of you. My encouragement is to walk into that awkwardness, let go of the presuppositions about what trans people are like, and just listen to Steff and their story. Steff and I talk about their contrasting experiences of coming out within a church context, firstly around sexuality and later around gender, and we look at how those two experiences were different and what we can learn from that about the way that the church is and the way that the church can be. We talk about exclusion and embrace and the effects those have on people. And we talk about the ways in which embracing those who are different from us, and particularly hearing the transgender voice, can give us a fuller and more beautiful picture of God. This is a profound and beautiful conversation with a wonderful human. This is episode 83 of Down to Earth Conversations. Here's Steff Fenton. Well, it's my pleasure to be talking to Steff Fenton today. Kia ora, Steff. Welcome to the podcast.
Kia ora, thanks for having me.
That was a nice kia ora from an Australian there.
That's good, yeah. Glad to get that feedback.
Yeah. Lots of my listeners won't have heard of you, so do you want to just start by telling us a little bit about who is Steff Fenton?
Yeah, so as you mentioned there, I'm based in Australia, so I'm on Gadigal country, and pay respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose lands I am living and working on a lot of the time. I grew up in a really, Australia's country music capital called Tamworth. So that's my flavour. It was about 30,000 people growing up, but now have been in Sydney. I guess I reluctantly embrace that Sydney sider identity. But yeah, I'm like, where do I go with this question of like introducing myself? Because there's always so many aspects to ourselves, and which part do you lean into? First of all, maybe I want to say I'm an Enneagram 2 for those who are Enneagram people, ENFJ. And I'm very thoroughly extroverted, big people person. Sagittarius, for those maybe in the queer world who are into that. But maybe relevant for this conversation is I'm a trans non-binary Christian. So my pronouns are they, them. I have been part of the church my whole life pretty much, and just very recently I have found myself in a space where I'm no longer formally in a faith community, which is a new thing for me, but still thoroughly engaged. And, my faith is what drives a lot of my values and my purpose and meaning in life. And it's from that place of faith that I have been quite an advocate for LGBTIQA plus people, particularly within churches and Christian spaces, and kind of have just found myself doing that in different flavors in different seasons. Right now it's in writing and speaking and training. I'm a wedding celebrant on the side, but what pays my bills week to week is I'm working for an LGBTIQA plus not-for-profit called 2010, and I manage a team that delivers LGBTIQA plus inclusivity trainings. And so I sit alongside a bunch of people who support queer young people who are facing increased rates of homelessness and mental ill health through supporting those people through counselling, social supports, housing supports. And kind of, I guess, I'm just kind of blending between some of those things.
Yeah.
That was probably a pretty long-winded way to introduce myself, but that's me.
Yeah, cool. And we met earlier this year at the Awaken conference, which you came over and spoke at. So that's one of your things as well, is sharing a little bit around the place. Of course, Awaken is the conference run by Diverse Church, and I've had Craig Watson, who started that, on the podcast as well. So if you're listening, you can go back and check that out. But yeah, it was great hearing from you there, and that was one of the reasons I wanted to get you on the podcast today, is to hear a little bit about your journey, and then also about your thinking around gender and God, and the way that maybe who you are has brought you to different places than the way that I think about God based on who I am. So one thing in reading some of the stuff you've written is that you've had two kind of coming out journeys with the church, and those have been two very quite different coming out journeys. Do you want to just share a little bit about, I guess, how those two different, or when those different journeys happened, and then also how were they different, and what made it different for you?
Yeah. The first coming out, we'll call it, was when I was in university, living on campus in a Christian college, and there was a church attached to that community. And I was really quite involved in that church at the time. My minister had kind of taken me out for lunch one week and said, I think you're actually one of three core people in this community that keep this church going. And I'm really grateful for your input here. Was quite involved with music and leading church and kind of Bible studies and things like that. Alongside all of that involvement, I was studying communications, and also recognizing and realizing something about myself, which was slowly emerging in a relationship with a friend of mine that was becoming more intimate and close and, loving. Alongside that was a lot of shame and suppression and resistance. The messages at church were that to be queer, to be gay was sinful, wrong, a lot of that yucky stuff. That took me a long time to voice to anyone else that was my experience. For a while, I felt really quite isolated and lonely, and like I had to hide that part of myself. Then finally kind of came to realize that I can't run away from this anymore, and I have to sort of share this with people in my life. And the next conversation with my minister couldn't have been different to the one that we'd had when we went out for lunch, which was just immediate. We need to get you out of leadership. You can no longer have this place in this community. This kind of feels like an immediate threat, like you are coming in with something that will disturb and disrupt and negatively influence this space. So let's step everything back from how your involvement is. And really hurriedly, like I was like, wow, yeah, it's a real 180 turn when you voice the words that you're queer or gay into that space. And that was in the world of Sydney Anglicanism, which since that time and kind of staying and being part of that church, as I continued into that space, just felt more and more pressure to not be who I am. And they really advocate and have advocated against the inclusion of marriage equality and inclusion of trans and gender diverse people, and laid out doctrine after doctrine after doctrine, kind of campaign after campaign, resources to really fight against the inclusion of LGBTIQA plus people in churches, but then also in wider Australian society, kind of at every level. So
that must be pretty brutal, like seeing that while you're part of it.
Yeah, and also trying to say, hey, I exist within both of these identities, and it's a really common story where people, are told that these two things don't go together, and there are kind of battles happening publicly against Christianity and churches and against queer people, but then you're sitting in the middle of that saying, hey, actually, I have lived experience that tells you otherwise. Like, these two things live inside me and I embody these two things together. There is actually a different way to do this. But not getting platformed or listened to or in any of those spaces. So, it was incredibly tiring to keep trying to have that conversation with people in leadership and try to invite them into a different way of thinking about that. Incredibly tiring and, life-threatening too. And it is for so many of us. Yeah.
And so how did your next kind of coming out journey go?
Yeah. About 10 years later, I kind of stuck it out in that space, and realized, kind of followed that to its endpoint conclusion, that, this church had sort of said for so long, we want to try and do better, but we just can't. And I think I followed that to its endpoint where I was like, I actually can't exist any further in this space. And a few of us had sidelined to that, been having conversations about starting our own faith community. And so that was in just before COVID, 2020. Is that right? Started 2020?
Yeah, started 2020 is COVID. Yeah.
Yeah. Good year to start a church. But we kind of, a few of us got together and just started meeting together. It was pretty informal. We met in a school. We didn't actually have enough people to go over the requirements for meeting in person often. So for a lot of that time, we actually got to meet together face to face in small groups and kind of have informal conversations. We sort of did the breadth of things where it was more formal singing and someone sharing to, just sharing a meal or getting together for a social, different things like that. And it was in that space that my first journey was realizing my sexuality and who I love, and that was different. I didn't love someone of a different gender than I was. That wasn't my narrative at that time, and that's not who I was. That's what I was discovering that first time. But this time it was actually realizing that there was another part to that experience that was gender and gender identity and my experience of gender and yeah, just slowly having more and more space to explore the fact that I had seen people online who were trans, seen people who, friends of mine who were like assigned female at birth and had undertaken gender affirming healthcare, and seeing their stories online and thinking, oh, that looks really awesome. Like, yeah, that I kind of like, I love that. I'm drawn to that in some way. And then I was with some friends from that church. We were kind of on a road trip one time listening to someone talk about their non-binary experience. And I was like, hey, everyone, can we just pause this here? Just like a temperature check. Everyone's resonating at this point with this experience. Yeah. Like, we all feel this. Is that right? And my two friends were like, actually, no, we don't resonate with any of this at all. And I was like, oh, okay. Yep. All right. Yeah, I'm definitely trans. I'm definitely non-binary. This is in my face right here.
Yeah.
I just thought this was a universal experience. And one of my friends said something really beautiful to me that day. She said, when it comes to gender, you actually do get to choose. And that was actually someone who I was co-pastoring with at that time in that community. And so that church community became some of the first people who knew about my trans identity. They became the first kind of people to use they them pronouns for me and socially affirm who I was like slowly coming to terms with. And yeah, they were sort of the first people to see me for who I was and affirm that and love me and create a safe space for me to kind of come out as trans. And it really wasn't anything at all. Like, it was just kind of, okay, cool. And now we continue on doing church together. Like, we just know something new about you.
Yeah.
So it couldn't have been any further difference from like, okay, this changes everything about your participation in this community to, okay, this is something new. Cool. Let's keep going on that journey together. Yeah. And the church being like the promoter of exclusion and kind of, that first experience of coming out, very much I describe now as like this rug being pulled out from underneath me. Like, my community just disappeared, and my, all of my beliefs were kind of removed from me, that like, this is no longer yours. Just like all those foundations sort of disappeared. But in the second one, it was actually like a wrapping in of community, and like, okay, like, let's lean into this. And it was really my foundation for life. Like, and I just think that's what the church should be, is that foundation of community that is there for whatever comes up. It's just like, okay, and now we continue on. We figure this out together. Or like, what does this mean for you? And we're here to be part of that, and to love you as part of that.
I think for me, I mean, those two stories highlight, firstly, the way the church often responds to this sort of situation and how damaging that can be. And then secondly, how the church could respond and how life-giving that can be. And then if you look at the fact that churches are supposed to be communities that celebrate the abundant life we have in God, and one of those responses is taking life from people, and in some cases, literally, and that's horrible statistics, that in the LGBTIQA plus community, there are higher rates of suicide and things, and particularly when you connect that to the church. And so you've got people, literally being driven to death on one hand, or, feeling that, metaphorically, but still feeling very cut off. And then you've got this other way that actually brings life to people. And like, just even seeing your face light up as you were telling that second story, there was so much warmth and love and belonging. And I just think, like, what are we trying to do as the church if we're not trying to do that? If we're not trying to welcome people and welcome them in a way that really welcomes all of them, not just says, hey, everybody's welcome, but then you turn up and actually you're not really welcome. You're just you're allowed to be there because they don't want to look like they're excluding people. Yeah, thank you for sharing those. I know those are very personal stories, but I think, it highlights for people what we're talking about here, that there are differences in the ways that we handle things, and some of those differences are life-giving and some of them aren't. And so let's, think well about that. I was reading one of your things that you've written, and I think it was in response to something that was said within the Sydney Anglican Church, maybe even by the bishop. And you highlighted this idea that it's not often that the church actually comes to you and says, please leave. And yet kind of everything about how they connect with you says that. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, that comment came from the Archbishop, so the Bishop of Bishops, for those who aren't in these structures, of the Sydney Diocese, when they were meeting for their synod, their kind of governing meeting for that year, and there had been other bishops in other parts of Australia who were around the marriage equality debate that was happening in Australia and whether or not that would be legislated or not. Some Anglican bishops were supportive and showing that support and vocally trying to move within the Anglican communion that it should be something that the church actually blesses and acknowledges as well. And in response to that, the Archbishop in Sydney said those people should leave the church. People who support this, please leave, was his words. And yeah, for me, like, there was a lot of kind of backlash and, obviously, like, people shocked that this would be said. But for me,
those are the things that, like, you're like, he said the quiet bit out loud, like,
yeah, yeah, that's right.
What?
Yeah.
Sorry. Anyway.
But for me, I just felt a sense of relief. Like, finally, you've said this out loud. Like, finally, you've acknowledged what you've been saying quietly for so long.
Yeah.
Like, you do it behind closed doors when you have those pastoral conversations with people like me when we're coming out, and you don't exactly say please leave, but in every other way you say we need to act immediately and take you off all involvement in this church, and you're still allowed to come, but everything you're telling me is like I'm not welcome here.
Yeah.
And I don't belong and I shouldn't be part of this. And so yeah, like, for me it was like you finally owned it. And that, yeah, I was relieved to hear it. And I don't support any of that.
Yeah.
But at least then it was out in the open and we could talk about it, and there was an authenticity to the damage that they were doing, is telling people to get out. You're not welcome here, rather than it be something that kind of happened underneath.
Yeah.
And in a way that was really not brought into the light. It was bringing it into the light and showing it for what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I grew up, and I don't think I was ever taught it, but I absorbed this idea that if you were queer or gay and you weren't fighting against that to try and be not queer and not gay, then essentially you'd given up on God and faith. And then, like, there's people like you who, you came out, it wasn't received well, and you hung on in that space for so long because you weren't giving up, and you're just completely the opposite of everything that I was told that people like you would be like. And then you actually started a faith community. You actually were part of starting a church while being out. You hadn't given up at all. So, I guess that wild stereotype just doesn't fit you at all, is my observation. How's it played out for you in terms of your queerness and your journey with God? Where is God in the midst of that journey?
Yeah, I love it that it's like a little bit of a wild card, that people just by existing. People are like, you see them behind their eyes trying to categorize you or make sense of you. It's like, you don't exist.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think, I think about how much my faith has changed from, you know, concepts and ideas that are so removed from reality that you can say to someone, your identity means that you can't belong here, and to see the impact of that on someone else's body, and to keep going and to keep digging your feet in, of like kind of excluding a whole community of people, but like existing on an idea while you're just dissociated from the bodily impact of what that does to a group of people. So that real heady cognitive faith. I used to have that, and my process of kind of embracing my faith for myself and really like having that kind of be deep is to let that sink into the rest of my body. And I can't remember why I was going on this tangent, but now so much of my faith is about this lived reality, and this I guess like in those spaces of when I show up and I'm just who I am, and that lived reality, of just being like, I'm here and I'm a follower of Jesus. This is my faith and I'm queer, is like it's in me and it's embodied. And that's kind of when I'm like walking into spaces and people are like, wait, you don't exist, because in my ideas and in my faith that's disconnected from reality and embodiment, you don't fit there.
Yeah.
But it's like, and yet here I am. And I think it was a real unraveling of, first of all, it was engaging any sort of scripture that said, actually, it's okay to be who you are. There are different ways of interpreting the Bible. That was kind of like my first step. And then as I sort of unraveled some of those things, I realized like, oh, there's some real like systemic things that sit behind those ways of interpreting scripture.
Yeah.
So the fact that like we got to a negative interpretation of queerness kind of is about the people that sit behind those interpretations, and sort of started unraveling that, and then kind of got to the point where it's like, actually, you can also bring your full self into interpreting and engaging your faith alongside these other people who kind of step into the room with their own framework and way of seeing things, and do that in a really embodied, full way. And let's like see what comes out in faith. Let's see what comes out in reading scripture. And I did a Masters of Divinity, a study, and it was the first time that I kind of leant in and I was like, actually, I'm going to start reading the Bible, leaning into my queerness and see where I land. And I just started seeing like queerness left, right, and center in scripture. I started seeing like myself reflected back in so many parts of the biblical story and in the God who kind of sits behind and through and in all of those stories. And I actually started to kind of see, actually, there's a lot about who I am in this way that disrupts norms, that is so like God, and really going from this place of being like, there's no space for queerness in my faith, and I must resist this and suppress this, to like, oh gosh, no, people actually need my queerness to see God, and to see God more fully, because God is so queer, so disruptive of norms, so out of the box, so blurry, that like, like leaning into that part of myself, I was actually like, oh, I'm not just something that should be embraced. I actually am something that needs to be shared. Like, and people like me actually have something really beautiful to reveal about unique characters of God, and people might actually know our God better by knowing me. And so that was a real like flip of the script, to kind of in terms of like loving myself and accepting myself. And yeah, couldn't be further from where I started.
Yeah. And I love that embrace of, not only is it okay for me to be here, but actually I've got something to offer here. Because I think when you look at Scripture and the way that the church is supposed to function, everybody's supposed to bring who they are, and that somehow contributes to the beauty that is this body of Christ. And to go, well, actually, there are some parts of the body that we value, and there are other parts that kind of, well, they're allowed to be here, but we're not going to use them. It doesn't work. Just want to pick up a couple of things that you mentioned during that. One is the idea of, you started seeing queerness throughout the Bible, and I imagine there's a few people listening whose eyebrows just got raised a little bit around that. Do you want to just give maybe one or two examples of, like, where is somewhere in Scripture that you've seen queerness?
Yeah. A big one that's been central for me very recently, and one which you can go and find on the Diverse Church website, is like my talk at the conference Awaken earlier 2023, is around the identity of eunuchs, and eunuchs being people in kind of the ancient worlds, kind of. Yeah, it's a bit graphic, but it was a slave trade, and they were generally like castrated men who were kind of slaves, and people who existed in all gendered ways. They were categorized in all these different sorts of gendered ways. So sometimes, they were man enough to be categorized as a male. Sometimes they weren't, and they'd be categorized as a woman, or as an unman, or as someone kind of between male and female, or of like changing between male to female, or something completely fluid or outside of the box, or even gendered as like other than human. So but these people are uplifted as, there's a saying that Jesus says that, some have been eunuchs from birth, some have been made eunuchs by others, and some become like eunuchs for the sake of God's kingdom and bringing in divine qualities. And a lot of people have drawn links between the eunuch's identity and sort of trans experiences or gender diverse experiences. Some people draw connections between them and like intersex experience, but they're known sort of in a little space of the world as like real queering figures. And in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19:12, they get uplifted as people for both the disciples and the Pharisees to become like for the sake of God's kingdom. And you can listen to kind of a full breakdown of that passage in my talk if you want to go and look that up.
I'll link to that in the show notes so people can find that easily.
Yeah. But then also the like one of the foundational ones that is generally used a little bit more conservatively in at least a gender way is God created them male and female, and generally used to reinforce a gender binary. Some people might have engaged with some readings of that passage that explore, we've got God creating the day and the night, and God creating the land and the sea, and God creating the creatures of the land and then the creatures of the sea, and these sort of poetic binaries that frame that creation story. And then we've got God, who is described as Alpha and Omega, but these poetic binaries don't necessarily say it's this and that, and it's this or that and that only. It's not like we say there's only day and there's only night, and then dusk and dawn, those places where day and night sort of blend together. That's God's not there. God didn't create that. That's bad. That's fallen. That's sinful. That's disordered. No, we actually often say that's the most beautiful part of the day, is getting up for the sunrise and watching that blend of day and night. And God as the Alpha and the Omega is to say that God is, start and end and everything in between and all encompassing. And so to read God created male and female is to say, God creates these two kinds of people and a spectrum of everything in between, or a mixture of the two, or, something different altogether. To kind of see that God is kind of, and God is reflected in all of that spectrum of humanity, and actually God is something beyond that as well. So that's a couple of little beautiful pieces of scripture that I find really affirming.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really helpful. The other thing you mentioned earlier, and you just kind of touched on it again there, is this idea of God being reflected in that non-binary kind of way of looking at things. And I remember that's one of the things that hit me from what you spoke about at Awaken, was this idea of gender expansiveness as a way to see God and a way to connect with God. And you mentioned before, God is queer, you said. And again, there would have been a whole lot of eyebrows shooting up going, what did they just say? Do you want to just play on that a little bit, share a little bit about your thoughts on that?
Yeah. The way that we see Jesus as, God enfleshed in a human being, revealing God's self like in humanity is, doesn't subscribe to the gender binary of the time. There's really strict categories of what is male and to be strong and dominant, and what is to be female is to be submissive and weak, emotional even. But Jesus doesn't subscribe to that gender norm, and one of the funnest talks that I've ever done was just asking people, what are the gospel stories in which you see God conform to this binary of male, of being strong and dominant and in control, or ways that we see Jesus conform to femininity? And let's just explore the spectrum of stories that come out about the way that Jesus either conforms to male and female, and just the way that God just dances across this gender binary and expands expectations of how humans are to be, and is gender expansive. So that's one, is to kind of just go down that rabbit hole of exploring all the wonderful ways that God shows up as a human and is so gender expansive, and then just all these ways that we get the descriptions of God as more in masculine terms or feminine terms, like the mother hen, or I don't know. There's other ways that you can kind of look them up on the internet, male and female images of God. And just kind of as we flesh this out, we start to see this God who sits behind gender and just expands that, and is this gender expansive God. And so then one way that we can then take that is to say that gender expansiveness and the way that it shows up in our world is a revelation of that God who is gender expansive in that way. And I think the other thing about queerness and queerness showing up in the Bible, or queerness being an aspect of God, is when we define what queer is, and in queer theory, it's about things that aren't normal, and I'm saying that in inverted commas, or things which show up that kind of disrupt our expectations of the way that things should be. And if we then start to flesh out the ways that God shows up in unexpected ways, one of the greatest examples of that is, God coming and being sacrificed and being reduced to nothing. And, the God who created the universe just unexpectedly takes the scapegoat and is crucified. But then on the other side of that, unexpectedly rises and resurrected. And kind of all these ways that God shows up, and we expect God to be a certain way, and yet God says, actually, no, it's not that.
Yeah.
But I think we can go all the way through the biblical story and the biblical narrative and just see the ways that God is not how we expect.
Yeah.
And I would encourage you, if you're looking for ways to kind of flesh this out in your space, or if you have the opportunity, is to, do it with your faith community. Have a conversation and be like, here's the gender binary. Here's how we define the gender binary. Let's throw it out. How does God conform to this or not conform to this? And where do we see God across this spectrum of gender? and just have that conversation. And, how does God, subvert norms or show up in the unexpected? How is God queer? And they're really fun conversations to have. They're ones that, people are a little scared of, but, they're really obviously in our biblical stories too. Yeah.
I think that's one of the huge things is that, you're not just making up stuff here. In the Bible, it talks about God in ways that aren't all masculine. And that's just an absolute fact. We can't get away from that. And so, and yet the way that we talk about God in a lot of our churches boxes God into that male category, to the point where there's some people getting pretty upset about any use of a pronoun for God that's not he, him, But that's actually to not have read the Bible, because the Bible doesn't do that. It doesn't box God in. And like you say, every time we think we've got God in a box, God bursts that box open. And so, why wouldn't God have this diverseness to them in a way that we just haven't really contemplated? And, I was having this conversation very recently on an episode with Liz Coolidge-Jenkins, who's written a book called Nice Churchy Patriarchy, and having this the same sort of conversation of actually we box God into this thing because that's the way that a particular subset of the church, that is the men who are in power, have guided the story, have guided the narrative. But actually, that's not how the narrative has always been. It's just that's how the narrative currently is for a lot of people. And so, having you share stuff like that, I think, is really important to get ourselves thinking around what are the ways that we box our conversations about church, about faith, about God, and what are the ways that God would like to burst us out of those. I think it's just really beautiful the ways that, like I said, I wouldn't have, from who I am, I would never have looked at God in that way. But hearing you talk about God in that way brings life and beauty into the way that I see God. And so I think it's a real gift. And I think that came up several times at the Awaken conference, that not only is queerness okay in the church, but it's actually a gift to the church. And, I guess from your perspective as someone who is part of that world, and like you say, you've lived experience in the church and as a queer person, and those two things being married together, where have you seen that the church has embraced this? Have you seen examples of, communities that have engaged with this kind of thing? And then, what do you think the church as a wider entity is missing out on by treating the queer community like they do?
Yeah, I think it really began with the feminist movement, and the recognition of women as equal in the church, and I think when you start to break down those hierarchies, and again, my own context of faith still is, the Anglican Church in Sydney still is promoting the headship of men and, patriarchal leadership. And, I'm pretty interested in reading that. What is it?
Nice churchy patriarchy.
Nice
comes out in December.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Yeah. But I think once you start to kind of strip away the splitting of boxes of people must be this or this, and one of those people gets more power and privilege and hierarchy in a space, dismantling that. So I think a lot of that really comes from feminism and from feminist movements in churches, and you often get to see you get to see God revealed in the way that God did reveal themselves, which is in the softness and the vulnerability, and some of those other forms of Christian faith come out in that space, rather than kind of that dominant, aggressive, defensive, fighting sort of masculine, nice churchy patriarchy. I'm going to keep using that. I love that.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting when we started our church, New City Church, and it still meets in Glebe in Sydney, and you can access some of the talks online and join in online if that's something that you're interested in. But it became really funny how gender just completely disappeared from any relevance in that community, because people are all sorts of genders. They're attracted to all sorts of genders, and their kind of experience in the space just didn't hinge on gender in any way. Like, it was just like, what do you have skills in doing? Like, what's your passion? It was just really funny how I just realized one day, wow, gender just is not relevant in this space in any meaningful way, because that's just who we are as really queer people are meeting together, and it's just not relevant. Like, it was just so interesting, and how that's just kind of where that's sort of the bubble that I'm in at the moment, is it is that space. It's sort of where I've cultivated my own friendships and community, but I just realized how unique that is.
Yeah.
Like, and even in kind of organizing, what groups are we going to have? Is it, men's groups, women's groups? Is it, like, just the subtle ways that gender comes into so much? Or, yeah. Anyways, so
Yeah.
that was just like a funny little space. But I think in terms of the broader church, and why I think it's so necessary for churches to embrace queer people, to embrace LGBTIQA plus people, and to particularly trans and gender diverse people and gender expansive people, who are really copying a lot of the Christian movement at the moment. The Christian right movement at the moment is against trans people,
Yeah.
and gender diverse people and gender expansive people, is a lot because of well-being, and how it's like impacting our community, and how, kind of referencing my work earlier, I work in a space where people face increasing rates of homelessness because of the families that they are part of, who don't accept them, and they are, they don't have anywhere safe to be. And so they have insecure housing, and they're accessing greater counselling and social supports because, the exclusion and discrimination against them prompts mental ill health. It's actually, if we're going to be Christian, this is a Christian issue to be a non-violent movement, and to be a compassionate movement, and to be, a group of people who are humble and who have humility, and embrace that vision of the body of Christ, where we have difference and diversity, and that's so central to who we are. And that's so core, I think, is like, sometimes we can forget that, in order to really live out what we're meant to be, like, we should look around and see people who are so different from us, and who have an equal voice or an equal influence in the spaces that we're in our faith communities. And that's a struggle for us all, because we generally pull people in who might be like us, or, it just kind of naturally happens. But that's the beauty, I think, of the Christian faith, is it says, like, all diversity, all as one, people from all tribes, nations, beautiful body, which is represented in diversity, and that's the design. Like, that's what this is about. But then also, there is so much harm that happens when people keep perpetuating sexuality and gender norms. We have a lot of gender-based discrimination and violence that happens because we insist on, because our world, or in our society, insists on keeping this structure for how people do relationships and how people do marriages. Is, it is one man, it's one woman, and it's structured in a certain way that generally gives power and privilege more to one of those people. And I think it's really, really essential that we embrace queer people because they pull us out of that organizing way of doing life, and they show us a way to do that differently. And, that doesn't mean that queer people don't have problems with power and privilege or, violence as well and harm. But it is a really beautiful way to kind of really move our world along on one of its most commonly kind of perpetuated problems, which is that gender-based inequality in our world. Getting into queer spaces, as I mentioned before, being in church, I just realized gender doesn't matter here. And I wonder if, that beautiful quality expanded across the globe and expanded in our churches and kind of came to bring healing and to bring a beautiful aspect of God's character and quality of healing to church spaces where that just keeps existing. And sadly, it is one of the foundations that the church insists on standing upon and saying, this is part of God's design, when I don't think it is.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for taking time to share with us today. Really appreciate you coming on the podcast and for sharing personal stuff as well as that bigger picture thought. You've given us so much to ponder, to go away and explore. Like I said, I'll link to a bunch of different things in the show notes so that people can find more of you. But yeah, thank you for all the ways that you are representing God well to shape his community in a way that moves towards love and embrace and acceptance. And yeah, thank you for what you're doing to bring a bit of heaven down to earth.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for being a podcast that brings in diverse voices and creates that community. And thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure to be part of it.
Hello, hello, heaven. Will I hear you whisper to come near?
I am so grateful to Steff for sharing some of their journey and their thoughts with us. When I first heard the idea of a queer God, I have to admit my brain just short-circuited because I hadn't considered God in that way before. But hearing Steff talk about what queer means, this idea of the disruption of that which is considered normal, then I totally see God acting in that way throughout the story of the Bible and beyond. Steff's reflections on themselves and their place in the story of God opens up to us a God whose love is unbelievably expansive and who refuses to fit any of the boxes we put on them. To those of you who have listened to this conversation and who are feeling a little bit awkward, or you're just not sure what you feel about the conversation that you've heard, how it relates to the things that you believe, my encouragement to you is to stay in that place of awkwardness. Let it drive questions. Let it drive a desire to hear more stories. Don't run away from that awkward space, because those awkward spaces are where we grow, where we allow ourselves to be stretched. And in my experience, it's in those awkward places that we find God. So thank you, Steff, for who you are and for what you do. Here is a blessing for you. Steff, may you continue to find ways to speak into the lives of others, empowering those who are othered, diminished, and discarded. And may they find their own sense of immense worth as you love and embrace them for who they are. May you continue to know yourself more and more, and in doing so, learn more and more of the God you serve. And may that assuredness in your identity help to shield you from the haters, the ignorant, and those who might take their fears and their insecurities out on you. As you have recently ended a chapter in your story, moving on from the community you helped to lead, may God give you grace for the new season, relationships that hold you on your journey, and more spaces in which to have a voice, because your voice, in all its changing beauty, needs to be heard. May you always remember that not only do you deserve to be embraced for who you are, but who you are needs to be shared with the world, that we might all receive a fuller understanding of the God who makes us in our glorious diversity. May you know peace and comfort in the hard times and the good. And lastly, may you know you are seen, you are heard, and you are loved. Thanks to Strawn for the music and Rangi for the karakia. Join me next time when I talk to Brodie and Raina, two of the awesome volunteers for the charity Orange Sky here in Ōtautahi, Christchurch. Orange Sky provide free shower and laundry services for those who are in need, either unhoused or financially struggling to survive. Brodie and Raina share about how they heard about Orange Sky, why they got involved, and the difference they see it making in the lives of those who use the service. It's another fantastic conversation with people who care and who give their time to spread a bit of joy and dignity in the world. Until then, me inoi tātou.
E tō mātou matua I te rangi, kia tapu tō ingoa, kia tau mai tō rangatiratanga, kia mea te tau e pai ai ki runga ki te whenua, kia rite anō ki tō te rangi. Homai kia mātou ai nei, he taro mā mātou mō tēnei rā. Muro o mātou hara, me mātou hoki e muru nei I o te hunga, e hara ana kia mātou. Aua hoki mātou e kawea, kia whakawaia, engari whakaorangi a mātou I te kino. Amen.